Well, good evening, everyone. It is good to see y'all this evening. I sound like two people young. Come on, y'all. No, I get it. We had to take a nap this afternoon, too. We are going to be looking at Columbo number 3 tonight. This is the third of 3. However, this one takes a little more working through in some ways, so we're going to split it up in at least a couple parts as we go through it. But to remind us where we were, or where we've gotten to, we've looked at 2 steps in Columbo so far as we're looking at this idea of tactics, how to employ certain tactics, and talking to people about especially difficult, controversial, awkward topics, things like that, and getting them to the point where we can talk about things related to the gospel, get them a little closer to where they need to be as far as their understanding of the truth. So all those things we've been talking about. We've talked about 2 questions, and then we talked last week about a couple of helpful things to kind of get us out of hot spots. So, for example, if someone offers you the floor, but they still control the situation, it's usually a trap. Don't fall for that. Or, if you're in this situation where, well, now it's slipping my mind. I just had it. If you're in a situation where you are ultimately, no, I'm gonna give up on that. I'll remember it later. The other thing, though, that I was going to mention to us as we go into to number 3, though, 2 things that we need to be aware of as we are entering chapter 3, or number 3. Those 2 questions. What's our first question that we talked about?
What do you mean by that?
What do you mean by that? Someone brings up something, especially if they make a statement that we know is contrary to what God says. What do you mean by that? What's the second question? How did you come to that conclusion? What do you mean by that? How do you come to that conclusion? Those 2 questions, just by themselves, are going to be extremely helpful to us in any kind of conversation. A lot of times, they'll get us a long way towards where we need to go. Man, I'm struggling with my words tonight. A long ways toward where we need to go just by those 2 questions. But there's a little more that we can do as we move forward, which is why we're going to Columbo chapter 3. If you remember, what do you mean by that? We're really just trying to gain information. That's Columbo 1. If we are saying, where did you come or how did you come to that conclusion, we are trying to essentially reverse the burden of proof. We're trying to say, okay, well, hold on, you made a statement. You don't just get to make a statement and everyone assume it's true. You got to prove your statement. So that's number 2. We're trying to reverse the burden of proof. They have to prove what they've said. Number 3 is where we're trying to really nail down a point of our own. Now, the key here is we're still asking questions. This whole process is built, as we've talked a lot about, on Jesus' model that he gives us of asking questions as your primary teaching tool. So we're still trying to make a point by asking questions, which is key to this whole idea. I want us to think about something as we go into this concept. The goal is not to tell them the answer, but to help them find it on their own. We've mentioned this several times before, but I want to reemphasize it as we begin. The goal is not to tell them the answer, but to help them find it on their own. Why? Why should that be our goal? Okay. Can I tell someone the answer or the fact, the truth about a topic? Sure. Is what I'm saying true? Sure. But if someone discovers on their own a conclusion they had not previously come to, versus if they're just told the answer, which one are they going to remember better? Which one is going to become more ingrained in their minds and their hearts? As Phyllis said, this is the point of doing it this way. It's not that it is somehow morally wrong to just tell them the answer to something, or somehow morally wrong, or it isn't true. We're trying to help them learn. We're trying to build a foundation. And I guarantee you, if you help someone come to a conclusion for themselves, they are going to retain that foundational understanding a whole lot better than if they just get spoon-fed answers. That's why, for example, from a teaching perspective, for those of you who taught in a classroom or in any kind of context, you want people to ask questions. Why? Not because you then get to give them the answer, because that shows they're trying to work toward the answer already. And your job is to guide them down that path, guide them through that process. Think about a puzzle for a moment. We've mentioned puzzles in a few different illustrations, but I want to use a slightly different one as we get started tonight. Now, Liz really loves puzzles. Not that I don't, but this is one of her favorite things to do, is just put together a puzzle. It's nice, it's relaxing. She'll usually have something on the background. Sometimes the movies that I like, that she doesn't necessarily like, I'll put one of those in the background so that she can watch it, but also be doing something, right? But as she's putting together a puzzle, what do you think she has in front of her? The pieces? What else? A picture. She has the pieces in front of her, hopefully all the pieces, right? There's nothing more frustrating than a missing piece of a puzzle. But hopefully she has all the pieces in front of her, and she has a picture of what she's trying to create with these pieces of the puzzle, what the final product is supposed to look like. Now, I want you to imagine for a moment, as we're beginning to understand the concept of Columbo 3, I want you to think for a moment, what happens if you don't have the picture? Okay, good. It's a lot harder to put together if you don't know the direction you're going. What happens if you don't know the picture, and then someone who also doesn't know the picture begins helping you, and gradually you start seeing something emerging? Well, that's an interesting experience, right? Or what happens if someone who does know what it's supposed to look like, but doesn't have the picture, or at least doesn't hand you the picture, starts helping you along? You get that sense of discovery that you may not get otherwise. Now, I'm not advocating putting puzzles together that way, but I say all that to prove this point. A lot of people have a lot of the pieces already. They just don't know how they fit together. A lot of people have a lot of pieces of life's puzzle somewhere in their brain. They've learned a lot of these pieces. I'm alluding kind of to Romans chapter 1, right? His invisible attributes are clearly seen. A lot of people just haven't put all those pieces together yet. But they have a lot of the foundational concepts. They just need someone to help them. They need the picture. They need the help. They need the person sitting beside them helping to put the picture together. Our job, a lot of times, will be much easier if we know which pieces they already have, and all we're doing is guiding them into how to put them together. That's a big part of Columbo 3. Once a person has all the pieces, they need someone to show them how they connect. They need to see how they connect. And then the picture will begin to form on its own. Columbo 1. What do you mean by that? In terms of this illustration, what does that do for me? If I ask, what do you mean by that? What does that help me do? It tells you more about the pieces they already have in front of them. Then, how did you come to that conclusion? What does that do? And this is getting a little bit harder of a question, in terms of the illustration anyway. Have you ever put a puzzle together and put the wrong piece in the wrong slot? Maybe it's a little bit smaller than you think it is, but it's like, oh, well, it seems like it fits. And then later on you realize, oh, no, that doesn't fit at all. A lot of times, what do you mean by that? That helps you see some of the basic pieces. And then, how did you come to that conclusion? At least for you, maybe not for them yet, exposes some of the connections they made that aren't right. So now, based on those two pieces of information, based on what we have gathered so far, where we're at in the conversation, we get to move on to Columbo 3. There's not a specific question for Columbo 3. I know that makes it a little harder. That's why we're taking a little more time on this. The reason is you have to have the answers to 1 and 2 to create number 3's question. Number 1, what do you mean by that? That gives you some information. Number 2, how did you come to that conclusion? That gives you more information, not necessarily about their position, but about how they support their position. Then you take those things, take that information, in any given situation, in any given topic, and you create what we call a leading question. Now let's talk about that phrase, a leading question, for a second. In a courtroom, there's such a thing as leading the witness. What does that mean? Somebody tell us what that means. Do what? Okay, making them say what you want them to say. How? How do you do that in a courtroom? Okay. Not just the specificity, though. What kind of specific question? You're on the right track. Do what? Okay, undeniable facts are good. If you're leading the witness, essentially, there's already something within the question that is moving them towards a certain direction. So, for example, so you weren't even in the house the night such and such was killed. Well, if they haven't said that or anything close to that, that might be a leading question, right? You're putting words in their mouth and they just have to say yes or no. That's going to be a lot easier for a witness to be drawn along in the direction you want them to if you're essentially just giving them something and letting them go along with it. That's not exactly what we're talking about when we talk about a leading question here. It sounds very similar, and it is similar in terms of the idea in a way, but I want to clarify what we're talking about when we say leading question. A leading question, for our purposes, we are trying to get someone to go from where we've been with steps 1 and 2, and we're trying to ask a question that's going, as we already said, to make a point of some kind. We're not trying to put words in their mouth. We're trying to lead them to a conclusion. That's where the leading part comes in. Instead of putting words in their mouth, we're trying to lead them to a conclusion with our question. Let's give some examples here. Would you agree that blank? There are several ways that we can phrase our Columbo 3 question. But this is one of the ways, and this is obviously a general umbrella category, right? We could word it in several different ways, or do you think that, would you agree that, all these different ways. If they have a lot of the pieces of the puzzle, well, then we have the same pieces, right? If they have some of the genuine pieces of the puzzle, then that means we have common ground. We talked about that a lot in the series we just finished on Sunday mornings. If we both then share some of the same pieces of the puzzle, that means we have a good starting point. That's some of the stuff we discovered with Columbo 1. So would you agree that such and such is true? In that case, then you just lead them one step further. In that case, what does that imply about this? What does that imply about that? Let's use an example that he uses in the book. They have a conversation, or he's having a conversation rather, with a young woman who is a Christian, interestingly enough. She is a Christian, yet she doesn't understand why sincere people who don't believe in Christianity still can't be right with God. Now, that sounds strange, and it should, right? But that is not uncommon in our day and time. There are a lot of people, including Christians, who say, well, yes, obviously, I want to be faithful to my religion, but there are other religions out there that people sincerely follow. Who am I to say that they also can't be right with God? Who am I to say that there are other paths to God? Kind of an idea. Now, what do you do with that? Well, what the author does with it in his conversation, he says, oh, okay, let's rewind for a second. You're a Christian. You've already told me you're a Christian. So he says, what is the point of being a Christian for you? Why do you need to follow Jesus? You know what her response is? Well, Jesus saves us. Now, automatically, what do we know because she just said that? If she believes that Jesus saves us, going back to our illustration, what does she have? She has a puzzle piece. She just hasn't put it together, right? So that's where he goes. He says, okay, Jesus saves us. So if Jesus saves us, what does he save us from, right? If we're saved, well, that implies we're saved from something. And he says, or she says rather, we're saved from sin. Again, very textbook answers, showing that she has the pieces, she just has kind of taken them in and not really tried to start messing with them. So he says, okay, I think we're on the same page here. Would you agree with me? Here's where we get our third Columbo, right? Would you agree with me that we all have a problem called sin? It's like this disease that doesn't have a cure, but Jesus can save us. He can cure us from this disease. She says, yeah. So then, this is where he makes his point. So if we all have sin, Jesus is the only one who can save us from that sin, how can people outside of Jesus be saved from their disease of sin? Now you would think someone who already has some of those pieces would have made that connection. There's a lot of connections people haven't made. Our job is to help them make those connections. Do you see what he did here? Again, did he ever do anything except for ask a question? This whole thing is based on questions. But what did he do with those questions? He's gathered some information, right? He figured out that she's a Christian. He tried to understand her viewpoint. Of course, I abbreviated the conversation somewhat, as I imagine he did as well. But then, based on all that information, what did he do? He put the puzzle pieces together, or rather helped her put the puzzle pieces together, again, through questions, based on the information he'd already gathered. So one way we can do this is find that common ground. Would you agree that such and such? And then you can make the point. Here's another one. Is this a safe place to give my opinion? Now this is something you use as a Columbo 3 tactic, not so much with putting puzzle pieces together that people already have in the sense that we just talked about. This is usually for a different context. If I say, I believe that homosexuality, just as an example, if I say I believe homosexuality is a sin, what happens if I'm just out in the world and I say that? Don't stone me for having a pride flag on the thing, by the way. We're talking about this topic. If I say homosexuality is a sin, as I'm just walking around in the world, what happens to me? People say I'm homophobic. People say I'm a bigot. People say all sorts of things, not about my position, about me as a person, about my character. So what do I do with that? What about if I say only those who are in Christ will go to heaven? Now, both of these, by the way, I'm not advocating you just walk up to a random person and the first thing out of your mouth is homosexuality is a sin, or if you're not a Christian, you're going to hell. I'm not saying that's the right approach. The point is, if you get into one of these discussions and people try and nail you on it, what are they trying to do? They're trying to paint you as intolerant, as a bigot, as all these kind of things. If that's the kind of situation you find yourself in, rather than just a discussion on different types of beliefs that people are open to, that's where kind of, do you agree with this? Can we agree that? That kind of works for that. But if you know you're about to open yourself up, if you tell how you believe, to personal attacks, well, what's the problem with tolerance in this kind of way? If someone says you have to agree with this lifestyle or else you're intolerant, what's the problem? What's the underlying problem with that statement? If someone won't let me disagree with a specific lifestyle, what does that make them? Intolerant. The only way that tolerance works consistently is if you're tolerant in both directions. If you know that going in, you've gathered a little bit of information, and they maybe try and nail you down, well, what do you believe about this? Again, an example from the book. Well, you flip the script. So, a woman is in the workplace. This is the example from the book. A woman is in the workplace. She knows that her boss, I believe also a woman, is a homosexual. That's not a problem in terms of the workplace. It doesn't cause any issues. And the woman who's working there, she doesn't have a problem working there under a person who lives that lifestyle. That's just the way it goes. But she knows that eventually there's going to be an awkward conversation there because she's a Christian. She doesn't believe that lifestyle is correct. So she's trying to figure out how to deal with this. And if I understand right, she asked the author for some advice in handling this. And he says, well, here's the deal. What are you afraid is going to happen? And she says, well, I'm going to be called intolerant and all these kind of things. Okay, then here's how you approach it. So the boss, at some point, they get into a conversation. The boss, not in a confrontational way per se, but asks, what is your opinion on homosexuality as a Christian? Because we Christians have a reputation when it comes to this issue, right? And we kind of should. We need to be standing for the truth, as long as it's in love. But she's asked, what is your stance on this thing? Guess what she doesn't do? This woman, this Christian, is asked, what is your stance on homosexuality by a homosexual? What does she not do in response to that question? Okay, good. She doesn't just come out and say, I believe all homosexuals are going to heaven. Come on. That's not the way to approach it, okay? What does she not do besides that? Even in a broader sense. Does she answer the question? Not with a statement. She answers the question with a question. Guess what her question is? Before I answer your question, I want to know, this is a controversial topic. I want to make sure that this is a safe place to give my opinion, to give my answer to your question. Now, what is she doing? By asking such a question, in this context, what has she just done? If the individual that she asks this, if this person says, yes, of course, this is a safe place to give your opinion, well, then what happens when she then gives her opinion? I believe that this is something that is not an appropriate behavior for human beings to engage in according to their creator's design. And the person says, oh, you intolerant. No, wait a minute. I just asked if this was a safe place, if you were going to be tolerant toward my opinion. Clearly, you are not tolerant toward my opinion. Well, you don't deserve to have such an opinion. Okay, so let me get this straight. If I have an opinion, it's okay to be intolerant toward it, but if you have an opinion that agrees with your view, well, then it's intolerance if someone disagrees with you. That's not how this works. You see what's happening. What happens, let's just take it the other direction. What happens if she is asked, what is your opinion as a Christian on homosexuality? And she very lovingly starts off with, well, I believe that the Bible talks about homosexuality as something that is not according to God's design, etc. She gives a very loving and succinct and direct answer. What happens immediately after that? We just said, right? She gets called a bigot. She's getting ahead of the curve. She starts off with, if I have an opinion you disagree with, are you going to call me a bigot? But she doesn't even phrase it like that. She uses the same terminology that they would use on the other side because she's pointing out a flaw in the logic. You see what we've done already in both of these examples? A question has been used to make a point. The first question that we talked about with needing to be in Christ to be saved, that exposed the fact that she hadn't made connections with her own viewpoint. She was being inconsistent with her own viewpoint. He just helped her make the connection. So it made the point for her based on something she had already all the pieces together to know. The second one, you're again making a point, not even about the issue itself. Notice, at that point, once she has expressed, is this a safe place, and kind of go from there, she's not really making an argument about the issue. She's making an argument about how people treat the issue. There is an excellent book Obviously, there are fish and bones that you have to deal with when you're dealing with C.S. Lewis's writings, right? Not everything that he says is true, but there's a lot of good stuff in there. There is a book that he wrote called Miracles. I may have mentioned it before. I personally, based on the books that I've read a few of his books, I think it's his best book. A lot of people will say like Mere Christianity or Screwtape Letters, both wonderful books. I think Miracles is his best book because he builds such an incredible airtight case about the supernatural. But here's how he does it. He doesn't start off with, here's why the supernatural exists. Here's why miracles are possible. Here's the proofs that the miracles of Jesus and the apostles happened. He doesn't do any of that, at least not on the outset. You know what he does? He spends the first, I don't know how many, probably at least half of the book, if I remember, and it's been a little while since I've read it, making the point that if you've already decided there is no such thing as the supernatural, we can't even have this conversation in the first place. That's what this is. On any issue, it doesn't have to be something to do with tolerance and stuff like that. If I know going into it, the other person has already made up their mind about certain things, I don't go to the issue. I start with, have you already made up your mind? Is there really any point in having this conversation? But I do it this way. Is this a safe place to express my opinion? Or whatever the case might be, whatever topic it is, for example, if it's the existence of God, do you believe there could ever be evidence that would convince you the supernatural exists? What happens if they say no? Well, why have the conversation, right? There's no evidence that could ever convince them that anything but their position is true. And so that's when you ask questions. So what you're saying is there's only your position that is possible to exist despite any conversation, which means either you have all knowledge or you're closed-minded. Again, we don't say it like that. We ask questions to make the point. Another one, and then we'll wrap up for tonight, and we'll continue next week, or I guess 2 weeks from now. What am I missing here? Once again, we want to be very intentional about asking questions in the right way. Let's think about an example, once again, he uses in the book. A teacher is in a class talking about how if you look at the skeletal structures of all these different mammals, the skeletal structures are actually very, very similar, which indicates ultimately they all have a common ancestor. Okay? That's the standard evolutionary idea, right? All these different design, or they wouldn't say that, all these different constructions of the skeletal system have certain similarities in terms of like their appendages, right? You know, the flippers and the arms of different creatures, for example, are kind of similar. They seem to have similarities. So that is indication that they descended from some common ancestor. So the teacher is talking about this, right? The student in this illustration does something very ingenious. They say, okay, I think I'm missing something here, teacher. Could you help me out? Notice automatically, what does that do? I'm missing something. Could you help me out? What does that do? Okay, good. It puts it on the teacher to explain. What else does it do? It shows humility. I'm not trying to start an argument. I'm not trying to be confrontational. I'm trying to ask for help. I'm asking you, acknowledging you as the expert, to help me understand this. So teacher, I think I'm missing something. So you're saying that these things are similar, which must mean that they have a similar ancestor. But you said that the reason ultimately that we can see that is because when we look at the tree, right, the tree of life, if you will, that's how they kind of refer to it, that this Darwin's tree of evolution. When you look at this tree from which all things derived, you see that these things are all related. But then you said that all these things look similar, ultimately, or we know they're related rather, because these things look similar. So I'm confused. Is that correct? Did I understand that these things look similar because they all come from creatures that have a common ancestor? Yes, that's correct. And you said that we know these things all have a common ancestor because these things look similar. That's correct. I must be missing something because it sounds like you're saying they're related because these things look similar, but we know that these things look similar because they're related. That's circular reasoning. I probably butchered the explanation of that, but you get the point. He's exposing a flaw in the reasoning, but he's doing it in a very specific way. He's not saying, I got you, let me show you why you're circular reasoning. He's saying, I'm missing something here. Please help me understand how this is not just doing this, right? Similar example we could use, right? This is maybe a more common one, although it's not the one he uses in the book. This layer of rock is old. You know how we can tell it's old? Because of the fossils that are in it. Well, how do we know the fossils are that old? Well, because of the layer of rock that it's in, right? Same thing. Now, I could jump on that. I could be like, do you realize how stupid you sound? There's a lot of people right now in politics and religion, all those kind of things that are using that tactic. That doesn't help anything, okay? To say, hey, you're an idiot to someone's face does not help the situation. You know what helps the situation is to let them have just enough rope to hang themselves, right? Do what? Very good. So instead, I let them explain. I let them try and show how the rock's old because the fossils are old because of the rocks. These things are similar because they have a common ancestor. We know they have a common ancestor because these things are similar. I let them try and explain away how that's not just complete fantasy. They can't do it. We'll continue this next time. But for now, I want us to understand the concept of what we're trying to accomplish here. This takes questions 1 and 2, this whole process. Sometimes we won't get to Columbo 3, right? Sometimes all you have time for is to ask a couple of questions and then the conversation ends. Maybe you're at a line at a grocery store or you just happen to have a conversation, someone else comes in and you have to change topics or whatever. You don't always get here. But if you are able to continue the conversation enough to where you've asked questions 1 and 2 and you've gathered more information, you have more of a sense of what's going on, Columbo 3 lets you use all those things you've learned to reveal a point that the person may not have considered. Now, what they do with that is out of my control. Just like when Jesus would answer questions with questions. For example, he asked, by what authority do you do these things? The Pharisees don't give him a straight answer. He couldn't control the answer they gave. He just exposed something by the answer they gave. But ultimately, that's what this allows us to do. We get to use our question. Now that we've asked more questions on the front end, we get to use a question to make a point. And ultimately what that does is that allows people, if they're willing, to start putting the pieces together more and more and come to a conclusion for themselves. I'll end with this. It is very easy for those of us who have been raised in the church, and I use that term, of course, understanding what we're all talking about here. I'm not saying we were Christians when we were babies in that sense. But those of us who were raised in the church, grew up hearing about the Bible, a lot of us didn't go through this process. Not really. We just were told the answers. A lot of times, we need to teach ourselves this process so that we can teach others more effectively. If I get, granted, truth, but if I get truth given to me over and over and over again, well, it's good if I accept it. But I need to learn to think critically, even about things I've heard over and over and over again, because other people aren't in the same position that I am. They need to be taught, maybe in a different way than I was taught, because they're in a different position than I was in. That's why we're studying these tactics throughout this series. We're trying to understand how to engage people in ways that maybe we didn't need to be engaged because we had some advantages that others didn't. But this is going to help us guide others from where they are to where they need to be if we use it correctly. If there is anything we can do to encourage or pray for you this evening, we invite you to come. The Lord's invitation is always open. Please let us know as we stand and sing.
I have decided.